From Deloitte Tax, welcome to the Tax News and Views podcast. In this series, we talk to specialists from Deloitte about the latest business issues and developments. I'm Carrie Falkenhayn, your host for Tax News and Views. And joining me today are two Deloitte experts in the area of remote work, Lorraine Cohen and Joe Eisenreich. And they're here to talk about the trends that we're seeing around remote work. We're now more than 2 years into the pandemic, and it would appear that remote work is here to stay. And given that, now is the time for organizations to focus on proper tax reporting for the long term and to think through their strategies around managing remote work. So maybe, Joel, I'll start with you, and you could just give us some background in terms of what we're seeing companies do now around remote work.
Carrie, I think your introduction was really spot on. The overall overwhelming feedback we're receiving from our clients is that remote work is here to stay. In fact, a recent poll of over 500 companies surveyed reflected that 79% of companies intend to incorporate remote work as part of their long-term talent strategy. And there are two primary drivers for this trend. From an employee perspective, they're simply demanding this. They've proven in many instances that they can be productive while working remotely during COVID and are really expecting to retain that flexibility. And then from an employer perspective, it provides employers with the ability to draw talent from an expanded pool of resources. So they're no longer limited by geography. And so with that, we're seeing employers focused in a couple of areas, focused on developing policies and procedures, implementing technology-enabled solutions, but very much with a view towards operationalizing this with a long-term perspective.
And one of the things I'd like to just interject is that as companies are looking at the policies around remote work, that they're considering the intersection between the remote work policies and hybrid working that they're thinking about and their business travel policies. Because now you've got a difference between employees who are voluntarily saying, hey, I would like to go and work somewhere else for a period of time versus a business purpose of a business trip. And there's an intersection in your actual policy of what expenses are you reimbursing and what situations that a lot of companies are grappling with. So this is a really important topic that just about every company is grappling with.
So how are the companies thinking about policies in this area?
They definitely come in a variety of shapes and sizes. And I'll say companies are really getting creative in this space. You know, at the extreme, you'll see companies going completely virtual with very limited physical presence. But surveys indicate that most companies find themselves leaning towards some type of hybrid approach where they continue to balance employee flexibility, but with the need to spend some time in the offices as well. And even those hybrid policies come in different shapes and sizes. Some employers are mandating that employees come into the office a certain number of days per week, a certain number of days per month, but others are allowing for complete flexibility. Some are placing restrictions on where employees can work when they work remotely in specific countries, in specific states, and others, again, are allowing for complete flexibility. And then you have these companies that are getting creative from an HR perspective, are thinking more about the employee experience. And so to the extent that they're allowing for a hybrid approach, they might also allow for employees to work anywhere in the world, say for a couple of weeks, 4 to 6 weeks or so. It's something they've never allowed previously. And then most recently, we're seeing, Lorraine, to your point earlier, the connection between business travel and remote work, where we're seeing companies that are allowing employees to tack onto business trips, either for personal pleasure or even to continue to work remotely in a given location. So lots of creativity and different policies and shapes and sizes here.
Sure sounds like that. So what are some key considerations that an organization should think through when they're developing their remote work policy?
Yeah, one of the first things that they need to think about are what roles can actually be performed remotely most effectively. So we know from the last couple of years that just about every job can be done in some kind of a remote setting, although certainly essential workers were still working in person. But the first step is to figure out what roles are going to be most effective for long-term business success. So that is one of the first considerations. The next consideration is how are you going to actually make sure that you're fulfilling your employer responsibilities for reporting and withholding, and that you have a way to keep track of what people are doing, make sure that employees are aligned with your overall strategies, not only for business strategies, but your compliance strategies as well. And then they're not exposing the company to unnecessary risk. There are some areas both in, as I mentioned, them reporting and withholding, but also the corporate tax presence that employees, by working in various jurisdictions, can create both internationally and in a domestic setting, creating the presence where the company might not already be present. So there's some pretty big considerations to think about and to drive through the considerations as you're setting up a policy.
So the companies develop their policy, but then they've got to operationalize it. What are some of the challenges that we see companies facing?
Yeah, so as remote work continues to get more popular, companies are seeing more and more remote work requests. And then at the same time, as Lorraine just mentioned, there are a variety of different considerations that employers need to consider before they approve these requests. So tax considerations, HR, legal, risk, IT. And so companies are grappling with, adopting efficient policies or approaches so that they can streamline the approval process. Another area of focus is once they approve the remote work requests and you have employees working remotely in different jurisdictions, how do you continue to track these employees on a real-time basis? How do you pull this information into payroll to make sure you're doing proper withholding and reporting? And then finally, on a macro level, to the extent you've got employees working remotely, how do you continue to understand the cumulative impact of remote work so we can kind of better inform future policy changes and feed this information back to the proper stakeholders? So feed this information back to tax or feed this information back to finance so they can make changes from a real estate perspective, so on and so forth.
So it sounds like a lot of new processes, not only to approve the request. Once you have a policy, you approve it, but then you need to know where your employees actually are and get that data to payroll, like you said. Is there a way to automate these processes?
There definitely are some new processes and technologies that are available. So, for example, we have a tool where you can have the employee go in and make a request, and it provides a risk rating and can give the company some guidance in accordance with their policies and in accordance with some of the laws and regulations around the world, some feedback on whether this is a risky situation and whether they're willing to do it. So a way to automate the decision-making process that they're already doing in a more effective way. So that's one thing, is to assess the overall risk and to decide whether you would accept it or not. The next stage, as Joel mentioned, was that the need to track and to manage these approved cases to make sure that you can do any downstream compliance that's necessary. So provide some payroll instructions, be able to trigger to payroll and keep track of when is the person going, when are they coming back, to initiate proper withholding and reporting. And Joel also talked about having insights. So the ability to be able to do and perform some data analytics is really important to understand how you might address the cumulative effect, as you mentioned, and look at what kind of policy changes might be in order, or how do you need to put in some risk mitigating strategies when you see that a lot of people are wanting to perform work in a place where the company doesn't already have a presence. Do you maybe want to set up an entity there? Are there other things you want to do to mitigate your risk? So there are a lot of things that you can do to solve this complicated problem, but there are answers. So that's the good news.
Well, thank you, Lorraine and Joel, for the update on remote work. It does sound like there is a lot of work to be done for both HR and tax around this issue. So it is good to hear that there's tools that can help them out. If our listeners would like additional detail on this topic, feel free to go to Deloitte.com and search on remote work. We've got a number of additional articles that you can find on this topic as well as related topics. And you can also feel free to reach out to Joel or Lorraine on LinkedIn. They'd be glad to connect that way as well. In the meantime, I hope you dial in for our next podcast. But in the meantime, I hope you continue to be well. Have a great day.